in Chapter 4, our final chapter for Math 60, this is the one that you want to make sure you are really solid in, because Math 65 starts right in at Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 requires that you understand linear equations and inequalities in two variables, but really the focus here is going to be linear equations. We'll do inequalities in the very last section, but we're going to spend the majority of the chapter getting really good at graphing linear equations. In fact, that's what I want you to keep in mind as the goal of this, as we start with some graphing basics and then work our way through to becoming really good at graphing. That is the goal, to graph linear equations. In other words, we can expect that what we create on the graph is going to be a line, hence the name linear equations. Okay, so some graphic basics to get us started here. Previously, we've been using just one variable, and when we would graph it on a single dimensional number line. Okay, where positives to the right, negatives to the left, 0 for reference, and you would put it somewhere on the number line, and we'd either talk about individual numbers like x equals 3, or we might talk about a set of numbers like x is less than -1. Okay, but now we're going to be talking about two variables, two dimensions, meaning that there's going to be a value for x and a second variable y, and that will have a value as well. So two variables means that we're going to have two dimensions. And to create those two dimensions, we need two axes. So you've got your positive axis, your y-axis, your up and down. This is known as the y-axis, which is the second one because the first one was your original number line, left to right, positive on the right, negative on the left. Instead of calling it the number line now, we're now calling it the x-axis. And for the y-axis, positive goes up, negative numbers go down. So two axes, x-axis, y-axis. Where they cross is the point 0, 0, and it's known as the origin. Where they intersect, or where they cross, is known as the origin, and it's the point 0, 0. And in fact, every point now that you could place on this graph is known as an ordered pair. So every point on the graph is an ordered pair. In other words, it has an address. It's going to have an x and a y value, and this is like its address or its direction, how to get there, where your x tells you first which way to go in the x direction from the origin. Then y tells you where to go from the x. In the y direction. And that is known as an ordered pair. And when you have that ordered pair, x, y, x is known as the x-coordinate, and y is known as the y-coordinate. So that every point has an address. You start at 0, 0, you go over in the x direction and go up or down in the y direction, based on whether they're positives or negatives. And when you're doing that, when you're placing points on the grid, that's known as plotting. To plot a point doesn't mean you're planning something sinister there or creating a storyline for a novel or a movie. To plot a point means to put a point on the grid in its place on the grid. And the last little tidbit that you need to know about the basics of graphing is that once you draw these axes and you start to place the points in, it's going to be in one of 4 quadrants. So the grid is divided by the axes into 4 quadrants. And we use Roman numerals to identify those quadrants. And you go counterclockwise from the positive quadrant. So if we go positive on the x, which would mean to the right from the origin, and then positive on the y, you would end up in this top right corner here. And so this is quadrant 1. And then you would go counterclockwise around to get to quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. Okay, so 1, an I before the V is 4, 1 before 5. V is 5 in Roman numerals. And then all of these quadrants have the same type of coordinate pair in common. So every point in this first quadrant is going to be positive, positive. Every point in the second quadrant is going to be negative x value, positive y. So it's going to be a negative, positive. Okay, this is your x, this is your y. This is your x, this is your y. The x always comes first. Okay. In fact, that's why they call it an ordered pair, because order matters. Your x value always comes first. Okay. As you swing around to the third quadrant here, to get there you would go left on the x and down on the y. So that's left is negative, down is negative. So everything in the third quadrant is going to be negative, negative. Negative x value, negative y value. And finally in the fourth quadrant, to get to this section from the origin, you'd have to go right on the x-axis, which is positive, down on the y-axis, which is negative. So you'd go positive, negative, x, y, to get to the fourth quadrant. Okay. So those are the basics that you want to keep in mind as you get comfortable with graphing. Okay, we'll go to the bottom of the page and start practicing plotting just single points.